From it, he was ticking all the boxes that you expected. He was actually talking about GDP being down, crime up, the cultural decline of the country. Britain basically needs to run Britain, not the EU. We've heard all this before, haven't we? Getting huge rounds of applause. And also, unlike he got on BBC Question Time last Friday, where he got no applause whatsoever, BBC was mentioned, and he was saying that, you know, the first question in that came from someone that was basically working for the BBC. Also went on to mention Channel 4 over the recent story about someone who was canvassing for them having racist views, saying that that basically was a set-up and a smear, which got a huge round of applause. Basically, a consummate professional coming across with personality, with drive, and with optimism, which you could say we haven't heard from some of our mainstream parties. Going to come to you first on this, Emma. I mean, he has the crowd. Obviously, they are there for a reform rally, so he's preaching to the converted to a certain extent. But what did you make of his performance and what he had to say?
I think Nigel Farage is an electric performer. I really do. And I think that we were watching that and we were actually listening and finding it really interesting. Yes. And I bet you I know there will be thousands, millions of people across the country who are actually tuned in on a Sunday afternoon watching it. And I have sat here and I've sat on many programmes many a time watching a Sunak or a Starmer press conference when one is almost asleep and, you know, really no one watches that stuff. And they have to shepherd a few hundred people maybe into the room and sort of group them to make it look. That is a rally. He has filled a stadium. I think 5,000 was mentioned. Mm-hmm. He's filled a stadium in Birmingham. Everywhere that Nigel Farage goes, Clacton, Birmingham, wherever it is, Dover, wherever he goes, he fills people. Thousands of people turn out to see him. And I think that you probably both don't agree with me on the substance of what he says, but I think that what he says resonates with people. Nigel Farage is talking about things that he believes in, and that's why he doesn't need autocue. That's why he doesn't need his speeches prepared by someone who's kind of vetted them. It's because he's actually talking the truth about what he believes. And then I'll shut up. The last thing is the optimism. He talked about optimism, and he talked about the future of our great country. And I was just sort of reading through the papers yesterday, and Starmer and Sunak both sound so depressed about the future. Who's going to wreck Britain in the first 100 days? Who's going to wreck Britain the most? Who's going to tax you the most? Whereas actually Nigel Farage is tapping into that optimism. He sounds excited about, you know, the future of the country and that we have some potential. And we're in such a bad way in this country. There's sort of terminal national depression.
Nikki, I mean, as Nigel said himself, you know, the establishment don't want reform to do well. They're happy for Starmer to take over from Rishi because basically they are the same. There is no change that's going to happen. It is like a different middle management taking over. What did you make of what Nigel had to say?
Well, I think some people don't want reform to take over because they're very worried about the repercussions of that party being in power, because they worry about how it's going to affect our culture. I mean, he talked there about cultural decline, and it's never defined. What does that actually mean? You know, in the past, Richard Tice has gone on about Britishness and the need to protect it, but has left it undefined. And these, you know, for me, for a person of left-wing persuasion, these are the kinds of words that make me very suspicious and mistrustful as to how they're going to be used in the future to potentially ostracise certain kinds of people that live in this country. And that is always my number one problem with the way Nigel Farage talks about culture and also immigration, you know, and I'm making that point there very, very cleverly, making that point, which I don't know if we haven't fact-checked it, so we don't know if it's true, but that point that apparently more ethnic minorities want to vote for reform than the Liberal Democrats,
this was a YouGov poll where the results said that polling with ethnic minority voters was now higher support for reform than for the Lib Dems.
Yeah, but they have ethnic minority candidates. They've never, Richard Tice and Nigel Farage. I know the point you're making. I don't think they have a problem with ethnic minorities. They're not talking about whiteness. They're talking about immigration. Those are separate things. They're talking about the influx of illegal immigration and the overwhelming numbers, that sort of the fact that we've had over 1 million in net migration over the past few years. They're talking about that as quite a distinct issue from make Britain, you know, this kind of this slight suggestion that they're xenophobic or racist. I don't see that played out, because there are lots of reform candidates who are ethnic minorities and who are welcomed as Brits, and they're welcome and they're doing a great job for reform, and reform love them. I don't see the kind of racism or the xenophobia.
I mean, for me, it's more that we won't know now. I mean, the only way we'd know is if we see, what happens if they were to get in. It's one of those things that it's like it's the slow creep of a language which pushes attitudes bit by bit, which is what happened in the 1930s in Europe. It's that kind of thing that worries me.
Okay. Unfortunately, we have to take a very quick break now, but don't go anywhere. We're going to carry on this debate about what Nigel Farage has been saying at his rally in Birmingham. Very quick break, but don't go too far. This continues. Hi, welcome back. I'm Dawn Neeson, this is GB News Sunday, and we are talking about Nigel Farage's rally, reform rally in Birmingham. I am joined still by Nikki Hodgson and Emma Woolf, talking about some of the key points that Nigel has said. Now, he was nailing everything that people expect Nigel Farage to say to a certain extent. One thing I wanted to come to, though, was it's an area that hasn't been touched on by anybody else in this general election campaign, is Nigel mentioned lockdown and vaccines. Now, that, as we know, is a huge controversy, and people are still debating that. No one else has mentioned that, and as we know, both the Conservatives and the Labour Party were singing from the same hymn sheet on that one. So Nigel's point is here, even though Labour are saying, we're going to give you change, that you're not going to get change by voting for Labour. What did you think about the fact that he actually brought the lockdowns and the vaccines up, Nikki?
I think that's fascinating because actually none of us talk, well, we talk about it in the industry, but lots of people don't talk about it. It's kind of the don't talk about the war mentality that people have about it, because I think people feel so emotionally damaged by what happened and it's almost too difficult to process. So actually, it's a very smart move on his part to bring that back and say, look, we need to actually look about what on earth was going on, and also to give people the confidence that it can't happen again. Exactly. Because Labour and the Tories have given us no indication that they wouldn't do it again if they thought there was going to be another kind of diabolical virus that would, be spread. So I think that was actually a very smart move on his part to do that.
They have skirted around that issue, haven't they?
They have. And both Labour and Conservative politicians of various stripes were calling for harder, more punitive lockdowns.
Yeah.
And I think the lockdown issue feeds into so much, not just the mental health of this country and why we're in such a state, but also the fact that the economy is in the doldrums, the fact that we have so many people out of work because of being basically put on furlough. So many young, if you have a young child, the fact that your child, your baby, like mine, like Nikki's, in fact, were born basically in lockdown, how that is going to affect our children. The fact that older children were out of school for several years. When you were a child, you don't get those years back. The fact that we have teenagers now who are basically socially kind of unable to interact with others, or who are terminally depressed or anxious. The fact that we don't know what the future is, exactly as Nikki says. What happens if there is another one? We have this ongoing billion-pound inquiry that's rolling on. I assume it's still rolling on somewhere in the country.
Yeah,
I've lost interest in as well.
But that's not going to report soon, and that's possibly not going to answer any of the questions that we want answered. And I think it's a massive, massive issue.
The other thing I thought was an interesting point that no one else is coming up with these. Nigel was talking about traditional values. He's talking about the things that the old school Conservative Party used to talk about. Like, I know you rolled your eyes at this one, but marriage being good for children. You both rolled your eyes slightly about that one. But he's talking about the traditional Tory values that a lot of traditional Conservative voters out there at the moment feel that this version of the Tory party have lost their way with, Nikki.
Yeah, but I mean, he's such a hypocrite talking about that, because we know that, well, I'll be careful what I say now. Nigel doesn't have the best reputation for being married.
To be fair, he did point that out, that he isn't the best example of having marriage.
Right, exactly. And therefore kind of don't really feel he's got a leg to stand on to bring it up as an issue, as like sort of celebrating how important it is for children. I find it really patronising. I am married. I say that as someone who is married. And I find it extremely offensive. But I come from a family of divorce, right? So I really dislike it when politicians start to invoke these ideas about the necessity of marriage for, like, the bringing up of the best kinds of children. No, children need parents that love them, and they don't have to be married, and families come in loads of different shapes and sizes, and we're past this stuff, aren't we? And the reason people aren't getting married is because it's too expensive for a lot of them,
But the traditional values, do you think he's got a point there by actually going down that road?
I'm split, because I get personally, and this is not relevant, but I get personally really upset when people go on and on about how terrible it is. I'm bringing up my baby boy on my own. You know, he doesn't have a father, and he, you know, and so it's hurtful when you hear this endless stuff about children's educational outcomes are so much better if there's a father around. Really? Would you like a hopeless marriage in which that's better for children, or would you like a good, loving mother or father? You know, and also I don't think we should judge Nigel on the fact that he's been divorced in the past or whatever. I can't even remember if he's been married and divorced or divorced and married, whatever. I don't think that we should judge them too much on, you know, he's a billionaire, therefore he can't understand about cost of living or whatever, all of that stuff. But there is something to be said for talking about those. What are the values of our society? What do we want to promote? And also of our culture. What is Britain? What are we welcoming people to? Not that we don't let anyone else in. What are we welcoming people to? What do we care about in this country? Are we proud of our country? Everyone's proud of the country when the football team are playing. Like, are we able to talk about that? So I think he raises some interesting points, although personally it sets my hackles
But what you're saying about that, you know, that again, to go back to that Britishness and the values things, he doesn't say what they are. It's always so amorphous. And I'm always interested to say, well, what are those values? Do tell us, because I've got no idea. And I wonder why that is never spelled out. And I'm suspicious of that.